The advance of the Soviet army through the Balkans into Germany and the Allies' offensive in Italy and France made the new round of negotiations imperative. Churchill was in Moscow again in October 1944. This time, the conversation was a bit friendlier, but the contradictions were obvious. What Stalin and Churchill discussed was the spheres of interest in Europe. Stalin agreed to leave Greece to the West. He was also willing, as he said, to share the Soviet influence in Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. These territories, except Yugoslavia, were already under Soviet control, so the promises were rather hollow. Stalin knew that what mattered was the effective occupation, not the promises of future cooperation. What remained was Poland. They could not agree on the fate of Poland. By the time of the meeting, the Soviet government had already broken relations with the Polish government in exile. The Soviet government also allowed the Germans to drown in blood the uprising, which was started in Warsaw by that government in exile. They tried to seize power in Warsaw, in Poland, before the Soviet army reached it. This did not work out. The Germans suppressed the uprising, and the Soviets, for obvious reasons, did not help it. Communist Polish government was already in Poland, so Stalin had no reasons for concessions, and the fate of Poland was left for a future meeting. By the time of the next meeting, by the time of the Yalta Conference, these were the territories occupied by the Soviet army. This is what actually mattered during the negotiations. This is Livadia Palace in the Crimea, in Yalta. It was the venue of one of the most substantial conferences during the whole war. It took place in February 1945. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin at Yalta. By then they found a rapport, and they found a language, how to deal with one another. Roosevelt was particularly important in these meetings. He managed to maintain peace and conversation despite the contradictions between the Allies, and particularly between Churchill and Stalin. The parties agreed on the unconditional surrender of Germany. They also discussed the occupational zones into which Germany was to be divided. Stalin agreed that there should be a French zone, but that it should be cut out of the American and British zones. Germany, they agreed, had to be denazified and demilitarized. Reparations, Germany had to pay reparations. The Allies agreed that partly these reparations should be paid in forced labor in order to repair the damage inflicted on the other countries. The Allies agreed to recognize the Provisional Government of Poland established by the Soviet Union. And Stalin, in response, promised the free and fair and independent elections in Poland. Polish borders. The eastern part of Poland was awarded to the Soviet Union, but Poland was given some territories from Germany on its west and north. Here are Polish borders before the war and after the war. One of the points of contention was the fate of the Soviet citizens abroad. Many were brought there by the Germans. Some ran away during the occupation, but there were also Soviet citizens from the time of the revolution and the Civil War. The Western allies agreed to hand over the Soviet citizens, the Russian citizens if you want, over to the Soviet authorities, irrespective of their consent. Stalin promised Roosevelt to participate in the United Nations, Roosevelt's brainchild. He asked for the 16 Soviet republics to be represented there, but got the agreement for representation of only 2, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia itself, of course. Stalin agreed to enter the war with Japan, as he promised to Churchill earlier, but in return to southern Sakhalin and the Kurils. But during the conference, the tensions became palpable. Frictions showed the outlines of the emerging post-war divisions. There was a climate of distrust. What was also very noticeable was the massive presence of the Soviet security personnel, both military and civilian. The movements of all foreign staff were strictly controlled. They were watched. Soon after Yalta conference, Stalin found out about the negotiations between the United States intelligence and the Nazi representatives in Italy about the German capitulation in Italy. This increased his suspicions. Stalin sent Roosevelt a sharply worded letter and received a restrained and reassuring reply. But by the time this reply reached Moscow, Roosevelt was already dead. When Stalin learned this news, he was visibly upset. The change of leadership in Washington did not improve its relations with Moscow.